Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to tonight's talk. How's it going, Idris? I'm just gonna talk for a little, and then I'm gonna enter the Discord server. So stay tuned. The Discord server is in the link in case. I'll put it in the chat. All right. Okay. Let's get into it. What kind of momentum can our inner life have? What is moving behind our eyes? These are the beginning questions. We need a base platform to kind of, a liftoff platform. You see, when we wonder about the mysteries I find behind the eyes, they are ones that we have to consider if they are self-generated, and what does the self mean? And in some sense, I find it comes to an instantaneous moment where there is literally no space between difference. You know, a way I kind of saw sometimes when I write the titles of these talks, they're images, of course. And the image I saw was just a moment where I was just, how can I tell you? I kind of looked at life and I realized there's so many things that people want to say, but what about all those things that they don't say, but they consider? So it seems that the mind is infused in more data than it has access to in some sense. Where it feels its conscious mind, of course. It's very hard to speak about the human being if everything was whole. If we want to go the oneness route, there will actually be nothing to speak about, you know. But I find that Carl Jung and many psychiatrists, mystics, and scholars, their work led somewhere. And that was a way of kind of being able to acknowledge the unknown. The inner life's momentum, for me, there came a time where there were sort of intuitive rhythms. That means I became kind of less interested in the idea of myself, and simply I was being present. When I was being present, rhythms came. Now these rhythms were not rhythms like, you know, a beam of light is going through you or you're kind of jumping up and down. It's the rhythm. The rhythm was, it had to do with a sort of ability of the sense of self to feel it was destined in that moment. That means it's kind of like the self asking, what am I, and seeing what it is left within the moment. It's actually a very fascinating idea that when we consider we have an inner life, you know, people tend to just think of the survival of the fittest, of the external reality, you know, but the inner reality is more fascinating. It eventually becomes non-dual. Sometimes it is evocational. The unknown is evocational. That means you can say either the mind is attempting to break itself or the world breaks itself before your mind. When the world moves you, we can say that is karma. When you move the world, that is consciousness. I remember, I think it was around 2013. It was before I gave these talks. It was, I find, 2 years before, so it was 2012, 13-ish, where I'm going to share this. I wrote this book called The Great Work, and the experience was that I was pretty much in my room sitting down, and then I just got a glimpse. It was literally as if my mind became non-local for a second. When it became non-local, it wasn't just filtered by a sense of self. It was as if there was no obsession to constantly ground knowledge or filter it. Kind of like that Zen story where the guy gets enlightened, who's sitting alone in nature, and suddenly a dark minion sees this guy get realized, not enlightened, but realize the truth about the nature of reality, and he goes to the dark minion and he says, "Dark minion." Oh, sorry, he goes to the Dark Lord and says, "Dark Lord." It's when our senses are limited, you can say. It's as if you can make things. It's kind of like the meaning that I find that our knowledge is a container, and it can only hold a certain amount of data within it. I've personally had moments where there was an overload of data, but when the data was, like, how can I tell you? It's like first wave of data hits you, your sense of self. Second wave of data hits you, the sense of self feels a bit pushed or pulled. And then I find it eventually becomes that in the intensity of being pushed and pulled, you realize you're the pusher and the puller. Kind of like how Maulana Rumi would say, what you seek is seeking you. Kind of the edge of your mind is the presence of your truth, you can say. It's honestly very, I don't know how to say it, but the inner momentum has more freedom. Anytime I've closed my eyes, I felt kind of like my imagination was spoiling me. The data you put in is the data you get out if you are as an individual. But if you put in individual data, you literally live an individual life. You live your life. You look at this world and you see that, okay, you have given yourself freedom to be, and let's say you give the world freedom to be. And eventually, let's say there comes a moment behind your eyes where the world doesn't have to be anything else to be better or worse. It is what it is. This was a really hard thing. I find when the person is younger, they want to change. They want to change the world. When they get older, they begin to see that it's the self. They change their self. And how this self changes is that experiences will eventually move you. When I think of the concept of karma, I think of the lords of karma. And this is not because I'm putting a higher divine agency, kind of like, okay, there's a divine agency, great. We all have divine agents, they're getting 10% of our intuition. It's just that I realized at some point my eyes are not my eyes, and there was freedom from self. I realized the self was conceptual. It was momentary. It came when the attention sharpened. When the attention was concentrated, the texture of the sense of self changed. So imagine being a human being, living every day, kind of waking up and then sleeping, waking up and then sleeping, kind of entering consciousness, entering the unconscious, entering consciousness, entering the unconscious. And eventually you'll see these gaps in the middle are what is generating novelty. That means it's kind of like, Thanos. Let's bring Thanos into this from the Avengers. He says something that I hadn't heard it just from there. He said, he looks at Iron Man and he says, "You're not the only one cursed with knowledge." He saw it as a curse. And the reason is because the data that stays, you are responsible for what is in your awareness. If you stop being responsible for it, it's as if you have denied attention to the presence of your mind. This was so profound for me that I realized, regardless of how I think people are, regardless of how I think the world is, the moment is my mind. And that's when the ego kind of bows, and as it bows, kind of like how Osho says, like the snowflake melting in the sun, or how Rumi Maulana Rumi very beautifully in his poetry. He says it's like this light of a candle. I want you to imagine a candle in daylight, and the sun is hitting this candle, and so we see this candle has a temporary light. It's as if we don't consider our consciousness to be the supreme. If we did, there wouldn't be this many people, in some sense, considering God and higher dimensions to the world. It was a matter of asking first. They say ask and you shall receive. It's very important, because if you can't ask, you don't know what reality you're receiving. Eventually the person will find themselves, and it becomes very liberating. I call this when you befriend the mind, or when the mind becomes your ally. Or you can say another, let's make it more mystical. we can say it's literally when the soul of the moment visits you. The inner momentum goes at such a speed. Certain thoughts can move at such a speed where literally, if you were to see a cube spinning at a really fast pace, you couldn't tell if it was a cube, if you saw it in that dynamism. So what it is that it's kind of like either we use stillness and silence, the ancient yogic path, to kind of return to a sort of presence of the observer, or we break into the presence of the observer through advanced communication. Honestly, this would be one of those things that I feel I'm saying that others aren't, that I felt that the ancient world did not feel. The ancient world did not feel, they felt it was an illusion. That was the most kind of shocking thing. That when Elon Musk talks about there being 1/1000th of a chance for there to be a simulation, this world of ours to be a simulation, as if, like, imagine we started making video games, and video games went to such a degree that we started making video games that you couldn't distinguish it between reality. So it would be a sort of self-created truth, in which that truth makes the self forget that it created it. This whole relationship with the internal and external, just like how Sri Ramana Maharshi says, he says there will come a moment where everything you have learned must be forgotten, or will be forgotten. So this kind of distinction between the multiplicity of how we see our dimensions as a being, that can return to the singular anytime. That means that's another way of saying you can function in the moment as the whole moment. And only way that's possible is if there's enough trust of the reality where the ego doesn't feel it has to do the moving. So you see, it's as if silence doesn't necessarily mean it's kind of like Rumi says silence is the language of God, but all else is poor translation. It's simply because any sound brings with itself a framework over the whole picture, which is, it's not possible. I find that the mind has such an incredible ability to animate objective phenomena and also subjective phenomena. We consider we are how the subjective phenomena is animated. We think we are the idea of ourselves. We think we are our thoughts. And this has been going on for a long time, That means it's nothing new. Your ancestors thought they were the thoughts they had, and you think you're the thought you have, and eventually history goes forth and pretty much the novelty reintroduces itself. It's kind of like I remember I had a moment where where it was a kind of Buddha at the gas station kind of moment. I was just putting gas in my car, and for a moment I felt it was a very strange feeling. It was a feeling that even to this day I cannot put into words. It was like a moment of sight. It was, that's the best way of saying it. It was a moment. It was a moment of sight where my eyes felt ancient. They felt it. I felt as if I had witnessed the self that never needed to be a self. It never needed to be anything from the start. It wasn't a verb. It wasn't a noun. It wasn't, in some sense, it wasn't a shape. That's the thing. That's what I'm trying to get to. It wasn't a shape. So the inner life's momentum is a way of taking the identification of the moment with a shape, kind of either through advanced communication. Infinity becomes your teacher. That means there are certain states of being that when the person self inquires, literally you can't have a comment on the self. It's just how it is. You know, this sense of isness is very fascinating because the person thinks, especially a lot of people on the mystical spiritual journey, I find the soul searching journey. It's like we identify, we're trying to worship truth in, check this out. It was like objective phenomena, then it was subjective phenomena, then it was static objective phenomena, then static subjective phenomena. That's where we are. What's going to happen next, I think, is we're going to go to dynamic subjective phenomena. People are going to start worshiping literally the portals to the unknown, you know. That means it's like we as a civilization have perhaps reached a point where the language's edge is being witnessed. So what that means is anytime you can say the language evolves, new dimensions of reality are being acknowledged. The language is a sort of translation of a presence. Something is there, you know. It's as if this object is here, and it doesn't matter whether the word is here or not. The object is, but then we also impose the word upon the world that we see. That means I have often thought about kind of like why the time frame of certain religious texts doesn't match, for example, the scientific kind of time frame of a billion-year-old universe. You know, billions of years old, like countless. We can't even know, you know. And you know what it is? I also think it has to do with once the person trusts their intuition, it's like their life pattern activates and they start going through experiences that are meaningful. That means if a person is waking up in the day and their moment is like, how can I tell you? You shouldn't be looking for meaning, but I find that if you're just watching, the meaning comes to you. Also, kind of like how Sri Ramana Maharshi said, when you stop whatever it is, you know, whatever kind of practice the person is doing, then the wisdom finds you. You see, that means there are some lessons that can be like certain things that can be discussed vocally among human beings, but there's certain parts where it's the inner reality, and the inner reality's voice has nothing to do with anything you have ever heard outside of you. It has to do with an experiential constitution, like how the moment is literally an experience of design, whether it becomes dynamic or static. The poet Rumi also says there's 10,000 ways to kneel down and kiss the earth. That means we're in a space, because of its dynamism and change, truth cannot be static. Literally, we can't, truth is not like the same words in the mind of every person. It's not a linguistic thing that much. The language comes after. The truth is purely present, I find. This distinction between personality and presence is so crucial, because presence is how things are. It's just how it's being. Literally, that instantaneous thing I keep saying, right? And the personality, it needs a reference. Literally, you cannot be a person unless there's an individual that can move in a space. Or you can say there's a thought that can move in relation to other thoughts. That means if I think of myself, okay, I'm this kind of person in this moment, that thought is only there in relationship to certain things it's considering it is not. So kind of like you look at your physical body and you're like, okay, my body's not connected to the wall or to the building. Like, you know what I mean? Like you're separate from the environment. So similarly in the subjective, at least the way Carl Jung started to ask questions about the unconscious, it was through an individual asking. That's why he went towards the collective unconscious and the personal unconscious. Which inevitably it's the same, because it's kind of like what seems to man as separate minds can also be seen as kind of like the water is all in the same fountain but at different levels moving, So anyways, guys, that's the talk about the inner momentum. And only in moments of solitude, sometimes, not always. Sometimes you need people. Like many moments in my life, I was kind of in a sort of, I was ideologically possessed in the moment. Literally, I just felt whatever I saw was the only thing. And so literally, required literally external pushing. Literally, I had to snap out of that mindset. Or there has been times where internally there came an adjustment. So I won't forget it. There was a time where I don't see images. I don't give images that easily to the unconscious, because early on my intuition kind of said, don't give a personality to the unknown, because the known is changing. That personality will become chained forever to that unknown archetype. So what does that mean? That means if I say, oh, there's like, I'm talking to other things and other behind the veil, to creatures behind the veil, the moment I attribute a shape, I become limited to the shape. So the way is, it's kind of like we're in a world where you got to treat language like people. You got to give it its space. You got to treat ideology like people. Not. It's like you can't just go disturb the idea, because if you do, like sometimes if your attention goes on the wrong idea, then it literally takes like the glass orb has gone on that color of a surface. And only the freedom of a sort of unconditional watcher within, and I say within now, but eventually, again, the internal external is singular. It becomes singular, like literally inconceivably unspeakable. So trust was very crucial. For example, Socrates, when he was in the school of Athens, sorry, not when he was when he was in the school of Athens, he was he was kind of told to come to court because of, I'll tell you, just hold on. Socrates, he goes to court. Somebody who was against him tells the court that, like, I don't know, Socrates is spewing like his own kind of metaphysics in the moment. It's as if they had a sort of acknowledgement of metaphysics that was like law, and it was as if like Socrates was kind of breaking that law by having different dialogues on that topic of importance. So anyways, Socrates is there, and he gives this great speech to the school of Athens. I keep saying school of Athens, to the court. And he says something like, since my childhood or something, like from the beginning, he's had this inner oracle. Another way of saying it, it's kind of like the mind of the cosmos, kind of within his own mind, And he said this inner oracle would kind of tell him which moments he needed to exist in, he needed to go in. It was as if the trust Socrates had was what made him valuable to history, the trust of his moment. You know, because most people are constantly trying to change, not realizing the value they already have. And of course, everything, you know, just like how you can look at an object from many different viewpoints, you can, of course, look at a subject from many different viewpoints. And Buddha goes so far to say objective phenomena is empty. So when I look at this, I call this a computer, for example, in front of me, but it's literally an object, and I impose the meaning upon it, right? So it's as if we're given a sort of empty piece of paper, which is the existential reality, and then the experience begins writing upon this. And so the question of the whole, I find, inner journey, where's this inner momentum leading to, is literally how all the sensory, literally everything that has been received by the being, it has expressive value suddenly. Because if you notice, it's like certain things, I don't know how to say it, but trust the moment. You'd automatically have trusted your mind. Once you have trusted your mind, the mind doesn't need to be isolated. It doesn't need to be referential. When the mind is no longer referential, it becomes automatically on its own, instantaneously rhythmic. When it becomes rhythmic, you're going to eventually, at some point of kind of touching the veil of thought, come into a sense of what is the real you and what is not the real you. And you'll know it. That's the only thing I can say, because it's an instantaneous, it's literally like a particle realizing it's in a field, so literally no other particle can help it. It's an internal acknowledgement of how external phenomena is appearing as meaning. So anyways, guys, that's the inner life's momentum. So if anybody wants to come to the Discord, I'm heading there now. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I'm going to keep this on so the link is there, but anybody can join the Discord. I'll be there in a sec.